This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Hello, friends. Steve here with a quick announcement about today's episode. This episode is a part of a series that Mustache Chris and I did on the film Iceman. In this episode, we will get into some of the background and the history and the context behind the Iceman and other related characters in this fascinating story. The Iceman, of course, was the serial killer / mob hitman who developed and created an identity that may or may not have been rooted in fact. We really hope you enjoy these episodes, and then which will culminate in the discussion on the film. Before we get on with the show, one thing that you can do that will really help us out is if you can hit the like and subscribe button to this episode if you are listening on YouTube. Or if you're not listening on YouTube, go and like and subscribe to the podcast there. We really hope you enjoy these episodes. We'd love to hear your feedback down in the comments. Let us know what you think, and let's get into it. The whole story of Richard Kuklinski, the Iceman, meeting Barbara is really interesting because everything to me screamed that Barbara should have stayed a million miles away from him. And it was really, this is my impression I got of it. She got caught up in his gravity. He was like a black hole. And once she got too close to him, there was no escaping him.
Yeah, like he was working at, I believe it was like a shipping and receiving thing. And at first he just kind of bumped into Barbara and they talked for a little bit. And the manager, the boss, told Richard, you got to stay away from her. Don't you talk to her ever again. And Richard wasn't even thinking about her romantically in that sense. But as soon as the boss says, like, you can't have her, I was like, okay, Richard's like, I got to have her. And pretty much almost kind of starts like stalking her. Mm-hmm. And they start dating a little bit. And then at one point, Barbara's family, because they're picking up kind of weird vibes from him, they hire a private investigator to kind of look into Richard. And they start, seeing things that, not the murder, but just a bunch of other like low end crimes and stuff that he'd been doing and just words on the streets. And at one point, like Barbara steps back, but she says to herself, like, well, that's in the past. He's not doing that anymore. And then, this whole time he's still married to his first wife, which is another wild thing. And that's like a big thing in the Confessions of a Hitman book, where the people are really focused on, her family's really focused on, like, oh, you got to get a divorce. And Richard kind of struggles like to get the money to get the divorce. But we talked about this earlier. He has like low impulse control with that. Eventually he ends up getting her pregnant, and she starts seeing the real Richard, and she doesn't like what she sees, and she runs away, believed to live with her father in Florida. Yeah. And he goes and talks to her mother, and her mother's like, well, I'll tell you where she is, but you got to prove to me that you got the divorce. He ends up getting the divorce, and she shows him, tells him, where Barbara is, and he finds her, and they end up getting married because I guess it's the right thing to do in that time. And it's probably the worst, Barbara will tell you, it was the worst decision she ever made in her life.
That, and then the fact that once he was in, there was just no leaving, and Barbara knew it, that there was no leaving him, that either he went to jail somehow or somebody was going to die. Her mom, her dad, her. And how many times did he cause her to miscarry? I think it was 3 times through beating her.
The marriage went on, it was like 3 times. And like, even before they got married, he was like poking her with knives and like threatening to murder her entire. Like, I should laugh, but I mean, it is like, it's insane. And she, like, she told her mother this, and her mother's like, oh no, so this is where she is in Florida. And, you know, and during their relationship, because like Richard refused to like do any contraceptive or what have you, she would get pregnant all the time. And like the first 3 times that she was pregnant, as you mentioned, she had miscarriages because of Richard's insane temper.
Yeah, I really tried to think of what could Barbara have done to get away from him. And you think in so many cases with abused wives, and there's got to be something, but in a lot of cases, especially I think in this most extreme case, there was nothing she could do, period.
No,
nothing she could do.
Yeah, because I mean, you can get, in this particular case, he would have killed her entire family.
Yeah. You know, she could have gone, you know, say it was nowadays with, you know, there's social services for abused women and all sorts of things. Even if that was available to her, he was going to kill her entire family and probably her. And at that time, she was young. She might have even Barbara still might have been in her teens at that point, or early 20s. She had zero choices. I mean, you hate to say that, but she really did. There was zero she could do to stay away from Richard. Even her uncle, who was, I think, a police officer in somewhere in New Jersey, he went and talked with Richard, and Richard terrified him and made him worried that he was going to kill him. And he was a cop.
And this is the one that we haven't mentioned this yet, but like Richard Kuglinski was literally a monster, like in terms of like the stuff he did, but like he was a monster physically. He was like 6'5", 300 pounds, and just built like strong as a strong man. And I mentioned this to you earlier, like I was at the gym earlier in the week and I saw a guy and I'm like, oh, he kind of reminded me of Richard just because we were talking about it. And I'm not a small guy at all. Like I'm short, but I'm pretty thick, right? And well built. And I saw this guy and he was like 6'5". He must have been like 330, and there's nothing I could have done if he really wanted to do something. He was just a freak of nature. And yeah, that's just something like that we didn't really mention at the beginning of the show, is like not only is he insane, but he's also like a monster physically. He's like the Incredible Hulk.
Yeah, I mean, they have stories where he literally ripped the door off of a car, ripped the door off of the hinges, and I believe it.
Oh yeah, because it is possible to do it, you know. And he's picking up like I think it was like at one point it was like a marble table they just bought, and he throws it out the window. And Barbara mentions like it took like 4 guys to just get that up the stairs, and Richard just picked it up himself and just threw it out the window just because he was angry.
And you think about it, somebody who is that strong just naturally, and then when somebody's enraged and pumped full of adrenaline, and they're even, you know, that magnifies their strength like that. He is as dangerous of a person with the, you know, an absolute short of a fused temper as you can possibly get. And they're physically a monster. Like, I mean, this guy he was a bad dude.
Oh yeah, you know, and that was, and me and you were talking about it earlier. This is what kind of like separates Richard from some of these other type of serial killers, where like Richard was, we'll get into it, like his hitman like in career and shortly, is like he was like, you know, he's doing hits against, you know, other tough guys, and Richard was like a legitimately like tough guy and physically strong. And where like a lot of these other guys, they're kind of, I don't know, they're kind of pathetic and they're weakly, and they prey on, you know, women and like the elderly, like in terms of like Richard Ramirez. And they weren't like really fighting and taking on guys that were maybe could have gave them a chance.
That leads us really into this mid part of his life where Richard, he's established. Eventually, Barbara and Richard have 3 children, 2 girls, Merrick, Chris, and then a boy, Duane. Richard's absolutely over the moon over his eldest daughter, Merrick, with his daughter, Chris, and he has a pretty cold relationship with his son. So that's his family life. They move into a nice suburb in New Jersey. But really, Richard's career this whole time, it's mostly just small time rackets that he's into. But what he claims is that he's making his money as a hitman and as an enforcer, either killing people or collecting money for the mafia, people like Nino Gaggi, who's somebody who's as a name, keep that name in mind, because Nino Gaggi is a capo in the Gambino family. And his name will come up as we talk about Roy DeMeo and Richard. But I get the feeling that it's almost, you have to believe that Richard was probably just making his money through the pornography at this point, and maybe as an enforcer for the mafia. But it just seems to me like there's not a ton of independent evidence to support this being a hitman. Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
No, there's not. And I mean, he claims that he got into contact with, well, back it up a little bit. He claims that he was doing hits for the Devacanto. How do you pronounce it? The New Jersey family.
It's is it the Devacanti family? They were the ones who The Sopranos was based on, and they were the big family of New Jersey. Oh,
yeah. He claims that he was doing hits for that family. And I'm trying to remember. I can't remember for the life of me. I can't remember the guy's name that he was doing the hits for. And he did that for a bit, and then he stopped doing that. And that at the point that we're talking about right now, he's doing his pornography peddling stuff. And this is kind of where he claims he gets into contact with Roy DeMeo, because Roy DeMeo was basically the one funding all of this. And I know Roy takes a shine to him and kind of sees, this is what Richard claims, and kind of sees that Richard, they're like kindred spirits, and hires him for special jobs that, he can't really get involved in, or, people within his crew really can't get involved in. So I know people claim that this seems like this is a stretch that Roy DeMeo would have a guy like this, because, when we get into Roy DeMeo, he didn't mind getting his hands dirty himself, hundreds of times. So, I mean, but this is like a big part of Richard's story that he claims happened. It wasn't just like he was like a freelance guy too. So he was like doing work for all the different families, right? Because he was Polish, so he could never get made, and he was always kind of like kept on the outside. He was like a distant associate. I somewhat believe that this was the case, just because if you look at something like, say, like Murder Inc., one of the reasons they hired a lot of Jewish and Irish guys, and there were Italians in it, but they hired a lot of Jewish and Irish guys, was because it gave them a little bit of distance from the inner Italian circle of the five families. And I mean, I don't find it's a stretch that they would pay him a fair amount of money to do some of the hits that they talk about in the book. A lot of these hits were like kind of personal jobs too. So-and-so broke my cousin's heart, and I heard that this guy, did some things to his sister, and things of that nature. And then like collecting debt, it depends. Maybe you just don't have the time, and you hire it out to make sure that it gets done.
Yeah, it's the DeCavalcanti family of New Jersey. So we were pretty close with the name, and it doesn't. It's not super important, but I think the probably the most important fact is that if we believe Richard, that was his in to the mafia. The boss of the DeCavalcantis really liked him, and Richard says he did a lot of work for him, and that got Richard's name in with these other families in New York City proper. Some of the other things that I think in the Carlo book, and I think a lot of this is based on Richard's interviews, is that he makes himself out like he's an international hitman, like almost like the movie Assassins, or that video game. I can't think of the video game. Is it called a Hitman, where the guy's bald?
Yeah, I know who you're talking. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
it's kind of insane. Like there's one where he supposedly went to Rio de Janeiro to initially work out a drug deal with these Brazilian gang members who were in competition with the Colombian drug lords, but then eventually Richard kills them. And the story is so preposterous. It's either so preposterous it's true, or it's just total garbage. I don't think there's any gray in there.
I think in particular, like his international travels, like there's like a whole section in the Carlo book where I don't know, he's doing like the Nigerian money scheme, and he's going to like Zurich, and he's doing these like international like drug deals with Colombians and Brazilians. Me personally, I think he's just kind of telling fibs about that. But I do believe that he did hits for the mob. And I do believe that he had more than just a kind of a passing relationship with Roy DeMeo. Like, I think Roy DeMeo knew who he was and either hired him to do work or told other people to hire this guy to get certain things done if you wanted it done correctly, and you would be able to keep a certain amount of distance between yourself and the crime being committed. I mean, and at the same time, Roy would never would have been really part of the DeMeo crew anyways. I mean, him being Polish and various other reasons. I mean, that's not necessarily, I mean, Lansky was Jewish, and we'll get it when we get into Goodfellas. Robert De Niro's character was Irish. But Polish seems, I don't know, like the Jews and Irish had always been doing work with the Italian mob anyways. The Polish thing was, I don't know, like probably, I don't think it's a stretch to think that was like something else entirely, and they really kept him to the outside and only used him for special hits. And I mean, and he also claims like he killed like Hoffa, and I don't know, I find that hard to believe. And he was like part of the Paul Castellano hit, but then he gets like certain details wrong about how that hit actually went down. I mean, it's possible that he was part of those hits, but I don't think he had anything to do with that. I don't know. Maybe, do you have a different opinion? I think
my strong sense is that he was always peripheral to the real mafia, that he was running his own scams and his own operation in New Jersey enough to make money, and he would supplement his income with things that were going on through New York City. But I think he probably did have some connection with Roy DeMeo's crew. What did they call them? The Gemini. We'll get into that at a different point. But that with Roy DeMeo, but I just don't think he was ever central to any of it, that he was always just a useful pair of hands that for certain jobs. As far as the Zurich thing, I think maybe he could have been involved in some small time early money wire fraud type deals, but I do not think that Richard was going to Zurich acting like he was some sort of international businessman. It's just, could you picture somebody with, if you go and listen to the Iceman tapes, he has the thickest North Jersey working class accent. He's 6'5", 300 pounds. He's just not passing himself off as a high-end businessman in Zurich. I don't buy it. Maybe it's true, but I think that maybe he was involved in some sort of early 80s wire fraud type scam as just one of his many ways to earn.
Yeah, that's very possible. And like you pointed out, like he was always kind of on the periphery. Like during this whole time, he's doing like B&Es and other, like he's constantly doing like different scams. And I'm sure for his like pornography distribution, he probably did travel around the United States. It would make sense. I mean, LA, like going to places like LA and like some other bigger cities. But I mean, like, I don't know. It seems going to, I like the image of him going to like being like this high, like financial, like scammer guy with that thick Jersey accent going to like Switzerland and like just talking to these people. It is a funny image.
Yeah. And then going over to Zurich. And I think he claims to have killed at least 2 people in Zurich. And like to see that and to think of that image, it's so crazy. It's like you said, like a Bond villain or something.
Yeah.
So
it's
that
like comic.
Yeah, it's so crazy. So then that really leads us into his relationship with another person, this Robert Pronge, who was called Mr. Softy. He was he's the one who supposedly taught Richard to freeze the bodies. And Robert Pronge, if I'm not mistaken, he was something with the army. I heard a couple of different things. He had some sort of military service. He could have been as much as a Navy, not a Navy SEAL, a Green Beret or something, special forces. But then I thought I read somewhere else that he may have been in the Air Force, which is not known generally for its assassin style killing. But anyways, they really set Robert Pronge out as he's sort of a mentor assassin for Richard that brings him up to the next level.
Yeah, it's really, yeah, this to me is one of the more kind of one of the aspects of Richard's story that really hinges is if Robert Pronge is real, then it lends a lot more credence to some of the other stuff that he says. And well, we know that Robert Pronge was a real guy. And because there is a newspaper article about a guy that was, pretty much sounded like he was insane and was shot and killed like at an ice cream truck. So Richard bumps into Robert. I guess they were doing a job, 2 separate jobs at the same hotel or something like that. And they bump into each other at the bathroom. This is how Richard describes it. And they just kind of stare each other down because they both kind of realize that they're the same person where they're doing the same thing. And they just kind of strike up a relationship, almost kind of like a friendship where they're like showing each other just different ways of how they get their jobs done. And Richard had been fooling around with poison, like stuff like cyanide, just because it's really quick and it's efficient. Apparently Robert Pronge had created this cyanide spray and various other ways of having to using it and using like explosives. I guess that was from his military background. But the thing that makes Robert Pronge really stand out is he would drive around in an ice cream truck and with the full like regalia and everything like that. And he would use this ice cream truck for surveillance. And I mean, it is kind of a brilliant idea because nobody would think that they're being surveilled by, a good dude in an ice cream truck serving kids ice cream, because he would serve kids ice cream too. And they seem to strike up kind of a pretty good friendship. And the way Richard describes it is this kind of sounds like the only friend that he ever really kind of had. Somebody that they both really kind of understood each other because they were essentially the same person in a lot of ways.
And if you believe Richard's story, it's that Robert Pronge said he wanted to have Richard kill his own family for some reason. And I think it was kind of a convoluted reason of somebody who was pretty insane. And Robert Pronge claimed that he was going to poison a reservoir, that it would to kill one person, but an entire community fed off of this reservoir, that it would have killed an entire town or something, supposedly. I mean, I don't know. And then so I think that, I don't know if Richard, I think he did wind up getting convicted for Robert Pronge's murder after he had been in jail. He copped to it for something else. I think he copped to it so that he wouldn't get the death penalty or something. And it was but I think that Richard probably killed him, but I don't think it was necessarily that important that he did kill him. Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
No, but the thing is, it's like we have that one newspaper article, and I mean, it checks like apparently he was threatening to kill his family, and
Yeah.
he was like an arsonist, and like was a pretty insane person. And this kind of checks out with what Richard is saying, and I mean, it kind of lends a little bit of credence to some of the other stuff he's saying, where like I do think that this Robert Pronge character did exist and was somebody like Richard that did, you know, hits for the mob and did hits for various people and used his military training background and to his advantage, and was, you know, like a serial killer like Richard was. And the Ricin thing is interesting. You mentioned that because his logic was like, well, if I just poison this whole reservoir, then they can't say like, oh, it was just directed at the two people that he was trying to kill. Yeah. So they would just have no idea. It's so smart. Like it's so stupid. It's so smart that it's stupid. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like I understand his logic behind it, but it's interesting that like even Richard was looking at Robert and going, yeah, this guy's insane. So how insane do you have to be for Richard to go, this is too much?
Before we go to the end of his career and how he's eventually caught, let's quickly talk about the Jimmy Hoffa murder, because that's a key one there that I think we need to talk about. Nobody knows who killed Jimmy Hoffa, and a whole bunch of people have claimed to have done it. Most recently, probably the most famous one is that Frank Sheeran, who was wrote, I think it was his biography was called, and we'll probably talk about this later, was called So I Hear You Paint Houses, which was turned into the Irishman movie. He claims that he's the one who actually was the one who killed Hoffa, and then they had his body incinerated, and that was pretty much it. Richard Kuklinski says that he was a part of a hit team, and some of the details line up actually with what Sheeran says, that they lured him to this house, Hoffa to this house, but in Kuklinski's rendering of the story, they load Jimmy Hoffa's body into a car, drive him back to Jersey, they bury him somewhere, and then they dig him up, and then they put him in the trunk of a car, which is compacted, and then it was sold off as scrap. So Hoffa was incinerated when they melted down the car, presumably.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, like it's possible, but everything that I've read about people saying like was Richard there when Hoffa was killed, I don't know, they seem to think it's ridiculous. But I mean, if he's telling the truth about Robert Pronge, maybe he knows a thing or two about this, right? Like that to me is what's so fascinating about the story, is you're reading it and it's like, well, where does the truth start and where does the truth end? And like, is he telling the truth here? Is he not telling the truth here? It's, I don't know. What's your opinion on his connection with Hoffa? Because I think you had a slightly different take on it.
I think it's not entirely impossible. There were some things that seem believable on the story that maybe, especially as opposed to Frank Sheeran, that Frank Sheeran was really good friends with Hoffa, and Frank Sheeran was also really good friends with Russell Bufalino, so maybe he would do the hit. But if we believe everything, that's what we have to do, is if we believe everything that Richard said about him being a hitman, then he would be a really good person to do it. If he's full of it, then he's completely full of it. And so I think...
Or maybe Frank and Richard kind of did it together, and I assume they probably had no idea who each other were, but you used Frank to, because Frank and Jimmy were best friends, to get him in the house, because Jimmy didn't think that Frank would, backstab him, and then the rest is history.
Now, eventually, Richard is caught in the mid 80s by a task force of federal and New Jersey state law enforcement. And I kind of wonder, what were your thoughts about this? It's a pretty complicated story of undercover officer who went by the name of Dominic Provenzano. He was an ATF agent who was in deep cover and technically speaking, this had nothing to do with his job as an ATF. He was loaned out to New Jersey because he was such deep cover inside of the mafia. It's just so weird to me that the murders that Richard did, that he winds up eventually getting convicted of, they had very little evidence that he did it. There was, I think for one, there was only a body. Of all the murders that he was eventually convicted of, the 4 or 5 of them, there was really only one that could definitively be attached to Richard.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned Dominic Provenzano. I think it's so in the book, he talks about how he wears this wig and it just seems to really bother him. And he just keeps on talking about how this guy wearing this bad wig. It is interesting that they only got him for, I mean, I think he was charged with the 5 but there was only the 100% for sure. But they do have him on tape talking about using poison. This is, I mean, I know there's different theories about why Richard was being so like kind of sloppy near the end. And I tend to think that maybe he was just getting tired of it and he just kind of wanted to have it be over with. But there's also the theory that like he was just talking so openly because who cares? It didn't matter. He was going to kill Dominic anyways. That's what he was going to do. He was going to kill Dominic, and I believe he made up this Jewish kid that was ripping him off for a bunch of coke money or something like that. And this is why he needed Richard to kill this Jewish kid, and he was going to get him the cyanide and it is funny because like Dominic's like, oh, it's got to get done right now. And Richard said, well, it takes a couple of days to make the spray. And he's like, no, we'll put it in egg salad sandwiches. And Dominic Provenzano comes up with this whole story about like how this Jewish kid loves egg salad sandwiches. If you put an egg salad sandwich in front of him, he's going to eat it. And like, that was just something he comes up with on the fly just to make sure he gets it. It is interesting. And it is interesting how sloppy Richard kind of gets near the end, where he's just kind of openly talking about killing people and using different poisons.
I think that I never completely understood why they were so hot to get Richard. I don't understand where the pressure was coming from, because he really, criminal wise, if Dominic Provenzano, I can't remember his real name, but that was his undercover name. If he was so deep into the mafia, it seems like there's a lot bigger fish to fry than Richard, because I think they must have honestly believed that he was the serial killer hitman that he was. I mean, that could be a piece of evidence to say that he really was the person that he claimed to be.
That's what I tend to think. Because it is kind of weird that they would be such this hoopla about, even at the time, like this was before Richard talked about anything. If you can go back and look at the news stories, it was like a big deal when they got Richard Kuklinski, this mafia hitman. So like that, the story about him being a mafia hitman goes way before he started doing before he did the HBO documentaries. Which is why I find it hard to like, if people say like he's just like making it all up. Like I find that, I don't know. I think that's not believable at all. I think he made up some stuff. Yeah, but he was definitely, I think he was definitely a hitman for a mob, and he definitely killed a lot of people.